with some practicality. So there's not a really smooth introduction other than just diving right into conflict and communication. 70% of all marital problems are not solvable. Now, I'll just let that marinate in the room. 70% of all marital problems are not solvable. That's according, it's 69 and some change, but it's close enough. And so you say, well, then if you can't solve marriage problems, then why should people go to therapy? If you can't solve marriage problems, then why do you do marriage seminars? Well, we found out in modern research that it's really not about what you're fighting about, but how you fight. And that's it. The problem you're dealing with is inconsequential, even to the idea of very severe, what you would call pathological problems. It depends on the couple's interaction. Gottman, in one of his interviews, said he could sit in a room with a couple, listen to them exchange, and predict divorce with 95% accuracy after 10 minutes. And so, there's some markers for what we do. So we'll kind of walk through those, and then we'll look at maybe some solutions for that. When I listen to a couple, and in the old days, it was like going to the principal's office. You come in and tell on her, and she comes in and tells on you. And that's just mind numbing. I don't enjoy that kind of therapy. I'd rather get on the floor and fight for you to come in and tell her, A lot of times I've been tempted to go, well, if it's that bad, what are you trying to fix? You've convinced me it's over. And so I start now with, I do most of the talking the first session. I don't really want to know what he did or what he didn't do, what you promised. And I go, let's talk about some things that when you have these exchanges, are these things present? If you want to label them, John Gottman calls them the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse, which I thought was pretty cool. So the first thing is, when you talk, and this, again, somebody at the break said, hey, this is not just a marriage seminar, it works in lots of relationships. This is true in corporate America. This is true in coaching. This is true in elderships. If you have these 4 characteristics present in your dynamic and your exchange with other people, you can predict catastrophic system failure. It's interesting. I use the word systems, and I'm not really a systems guy, but I like to look at something in a system. And if it's true in this system, it's probably true in this system. Anything that is true vertical is probably true horizontal, if that makes any sense. I play with ropes. There's a thing called a vector pull. If I tied a rope around the end of that pew, assuming I could get a good bite on it, and stretched it to where it was banjo tight right there, and I put pressure in the middle of it, that angle of 180 degrees or 0, depending on how you want to do your math, when I put pressure in the middle of that, I put 575% of the load on both those legs. It's called a vector pull. When Batman shoots that thing into the wall and runs across it, that didn't happen. He pulled chunks out of the wall. You get catastrophic system failure. And so a lot of times, guys who climb in caves and guys who use natural rock anchors, if you don't hit the sweet spot between 90 and 120 degrees and you pull on that rope, you're causing things to fall apart. When I built the zip line in the backyard, I didn't put a back anchor on my pole because I designed it for children to ride. Well, if you have a zip line in your yard, the adults will get on it too, so my pole is leaning, and Jackie won't let me put a guy line and attach it to the house. She said I needed a 160-foot run, and I got a little close to her flower garden, but that's for a different discussion. But you put somebody over 90 pounds, and I've got that pole sunk 4 foot in the ground, and I pulled it off center with about a 110-pound guy riding my zip line. Well, if my truck gets stuck in the mud, and I can attach to the front hook, go to a tree, put a 2-to-1 advantage using like a trucker's hitch or whatever, and pull that rope tight and pull sideways on it, move that truck, because the same thing that works vertical works horizontal. Well, a lot of things that God says you do to get along with me, you do to get along with other people. We'll talk about that on Sunday morning: submission, service, and forgiveness. So anything that works in a marriage or work in a church, anything that works in a marriage and a church or work in a corporation, anything that works in a marriage, church, and corporation or work in your neighborhood. So these principles can be applied to any relationship. We're focusing on marriages because that's kind of what our seminar is about, but they're not just limited here. The same thing I teach in de-escalation and crisis intervention at the police academy, I'll teach at Mazda Toyota when I talk about them solving their problems on the production line when I do stuff for them. So the principles, if it's true at A, it's true at Z, that's what makes it true. So when you start looking at, okay, my spouse and I, my in-laws and I, my children and I, or me and the congregation, when I'm dealing with other people, you're looking for the presence or absence of contempt. And contempt can be real, or contempt can be perceived. A lot of times I'll say something and you interpret it as I was mad. Don't do any major important exchanges via text, email, Facebook Messenger. 7% of our communication is from our words. 38% is from our tone, and 55% is from our body language. And so, depending on that, I mean, that's a really tough. And how you speak and how you stand and your tone has everything to do with your meaning. And so it's super, super, super important. So when I'm in an exchange with my wife, or I'm in an exchange with an employee, or I'm in an exchange with an employer, I get to decide if I'm going to run it through my filter and register it as contempt. Now, when men feel disrespected, we shut down or we lash out. We shouldn't, but we do. That's just the way we deal with things. Women, females, only complain about things that they think are worth fixing. But when men hear you complain, we think we failed completely. And that's the difference in the male brain and the female brain. And so it's really not about what you say, but how you say it. It's really not about what you say, but why you say it. And so when you start talking about the presence or absence of contempt, when you have a problem or when you're unhappy about something, it needs to be worded in a way that it is a positive request to have your needs met. Look at Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 29. Let no corrupt words proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you've been sealed for the day of redemption. Let bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away with all malice. And be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ has forgiven you. So he says, when you speak, the things that you're saying can't be mean, they can't be evil, they can't be bitter, they can't be wrathful. They're good for the necessary edification. I'm telling you something to build you up, to make you better. Constructive criticism makes you better. It doesn't make me feel better, it makes me better. Okay? And so when I have a problem, I want to say something in a way that is a positive request to have my needs met. I've got a friend named Brian Sterrett. Brian was a magician at Disney. Brian had a weird sense of humor. He had this prop called the Pop-Up Book of Phobias. What could go wrong? So think about having something you're afraid of. When you open the book, it pops out. Well, I've got another one for you. I'm self-employed. I own the business. I set the schedule. I work for myself. And I like to deer hunt. Anybody see any possible conflict of interest there, right? One of the places I hunt is 2.5 miles from my house. I can hunt every morning before daylight and hunt every evening till after dark and still go to work. I can go climb a tree, kill a deer or not, go to the office, see people, and leave. That guy calls at 4 o'clock and says, Mr. Jones, I can't make it in. I said, don't you worry about it. I won't even charge you for missing it. I keep the stuff in the truck. My wife could say, "You're never home." Or my wife could say, "I wish we spent more time together." Now you see the difference in those two conversation starters. One starts a conversation and one starts a confrontation. Now sometimes it's not about what you say, but how I take it. You know, if you're in the backyard, you're throwing a baseball, and somebody throws a ball and it hits your hand and they threw it too hard and it hurts. What do you typically do with that baseball? You throw it back, right? And what do you do with the heat setting? I'm going to say, oh, so that's what we're playing. And all of a sudden you break a window. Because humans exchange emotional heat. Whether you meant to or not, if I get the heat, I'm going to send you back the heat. And it's like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. I've got a bat, I've got a sword, I've got a gun, I've got a rifle, I've got a shotgun, I've got a rocket launcher. We just keep escalating because we tend to exchange emotional heat. And so when a person feels like there's been contempt, and you've got to do two things. As a word user, I've got to monitor how I use my words. As a word consumer, I've got to filter your words. Now, the onus and the impetus is on you to talk differently, but whether you change it or not, I've got to translate that. Is she trying to hurt my feelings? Is she saying something mad? Or is she asking for something? Even if she's not communicating right, it's on me to try to filter out the contempt and find out what's really not going on. Other people's words only have the power you give them. And we don't like that. But other people's words only have the power you give them. I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. The eternal, spiritual Word of God will not affect a person's life out there that does not buy into it. Now, at judgment, God's Word will have everything. But on this planet, if I don't want to believe God, what He says won't affect me. If God's words are limited by whether or not I buy into it, then your words definitely should be. And my words definitely should be. So I've got to be careful as a word user. I'm going to make a positive request to have my needs met. And I've got to have a word, as a word consumer, your words only have the power I give them. And if you say something and it gives me this response, I need to ask myself, what are they really asking for? Are they asking to spend more time? Are they asking to be more affectionate? Are they asking to be better organized rather than just instantly flare? Because once you get that exchange of emotional heat, once somebody says something and I allow my amygdala, my threat receptor in my brain, when I allow it to be amygdala hijack and I go from calm to and we talk about our spouse has the ability to press our buttons. Well, you get to decide whether you react to a pressed button or not. Okay? But once that happens, once somebody says something, doesn't say something, does something or doesn't do something, and I go, you are now in an emotional state of mind. You're in the part of your brain that we talk about the fight, flight, or freeze. Now what we've discovered is everybody freezes. Some people freeze for a nanosecond. Some people freeze for a long, long time. Everybody freezes. But then you've got to decide, am I going to be in fight or flight mode? Now it's interestingly enough, that when you get into that state, anybody ever have a panic attack? Anybody know what panic attacks are? Just means yes, just means no, not voting. All right. Well, I talk to people all the time about panic attacks. Tell me what it feels like to have a panic attack. Man, my heart races out of my chest. My lungs are breathing funny. I get this goofy feeling in my stomach. I have tingling in my periphery. I get my eyes get narrow focus. I get auditory exclusion. When that happens to you, is your body working properly? Well, yeah, your body's working just like it was designed to work. God said when your body gets a signal that you've either got to run or fight, you need to be alert, motivated, and strong. How does your body make you alert, motivated, and strong? It dumps hormones in your stomach. Quickest path to your bloodstream. Well, once I get these hormones in my stomach, how do I get them to everywhere else? Well, my heart has to beat faster. If my heart beats faster, my lungs have to keep up, and then I don't need some of the peripheral stuff. Everything people feel like they're experiencing in a panic attack is their body revving its engine. And it doesn't matter if you're going to run, it doesn't matter if you're going to fight, you have to be alert, motivated, and strong. And that's it. The symptoms of panic is called state trait anxiety. I'm in this state, but I give it this trait. Well, it doesn't have to be bad, it doesn't have to be scary, it doesn't have to be wrong. Unless you suffer from dysautonomia, which is a condition that your fight-flight mechanism just shoots out when it doesn't need to, it's a normal reaction. Now, if you're dealing with a panic disorder or an anxiety disorder, it's not what your body's doing. Your body's doing what your body tells it, what it's supposed to do. It's responding to what your brain tells it. Have I considered that talking to my mother-in-law is a threat? Do I feel like when my wife is complaining about something, it's a reason to fight? Do I feel like it's a bad thing to have to do a performance review? When your brain says this is scary, your body's going to respond to it. And in dealing with panic and anxiety, it's not what your body's doing. Make peace with that. It's supposed to do that. You got to change the message from your brain that it's not necessarily scary or bad. Does that make sense? So when somebody says something in my body, my body goes into overdrive because that's what my body's designed to do. I've got an autoimmune disease where I'm a diabetic. I'm not a type 1, I'm not a type 2. My doctor says I'm a type 1.5. Which means, he said, you have enzymes in your blood that one of these days your pancreas is going to be a dumpster fire and you're going to give you insulin. But right now, you don't. And so I'm controlling it with diet and exercise. And what little bit I thought I knew about blood sugar was that if your blood sugar gets low, you get to eat sugar. Well, I work out with some guys on Mondays and I do jiu-jitsu. There's nobody in that gym older than me. There's nobody in that gym smarter than me. And I thought, I'll go wrestle with these guys. You take a class, you learn a technique for an hour, and then the next hour, you do as many rounds, wrestling live time with people as you can. 7 8-minute rounds. 56 minutes of wrestling at my age. And I'm thinking on the way home, I'll eat Pop-Tarts and drink chocolate milk. I designated Monday as Pop-Tart chocolate milk day. I was going to do it. I go to the gym, I roll with these animals. I leave the gym, I take my phone, I check my monitor. Blood sugar's 247. I called my doctor. I said, "You've lied to me. My blood sugar's supposed to be in the face." He said, no. He says, "Your body thinks you've been in combat." I'm not in combat. I'm friends with these guys. Nobody wants to be the guy who makes me, have a hip surgery. So they're taking it easy on me most of the time. Your body doesn't know that. Your body doesn't know your friends. Your body doesn't know it's a sport. Your body doesn't know it's a hobby. Your body said this guy's trying to pull your arm off and choke you, and your liver secreted fat into your bloodstream, and your fat turned it into sugar, glycogenesis. And your body doesn't care what your mind thought about it. Your body does what your body does. Well, panic works the same way. If you say, "I'm scared," your body's going to respond to the scare. So when somebody says something to you and you respond with that instant, and you can feel it. You all know when it happens, right? Your mom can say something. Her mom can say the same thing, ladies, and you go, we use the phrase, "it just flew all over me," right? Well, when contempt turns into that fight-flight thing, I get into what the second horseman of the apocalypse is called, and that's defensiveness. You bring something to my attention, and now I've got to respond to it like it's a conflict. I go, and now I'm either going to fight or I'm going to run. Now, in a defensive position, I'm trying to survive. So if I bring something to you or you bring something to me, it doesn't really matter how it works. If you walk in and say, "Hey, Lonnie, this needs to be fixed," and I give you minimization, denial, or blame, I'm not trying to solve the problem. I'm trying to get out of trouble. And that's anything. That's any behavior, anywhere, anybody, anytime. Hey, this needs to be fixed, and I deny, no, I didn't do it. There's nothing wrong with that. I should be allowed to do it. It's not that big a deal. You shouldn't feel that way about it. Or I only did it because of what you did. Minimization, denial, blame are signs of being disingenuous. Samuel walks up to Saul. "Why have you disobeyed the Lord?" "I have obeyed the Lord." Denial. "Well, if you obeyed the Lord, why do I hear cattle and sheep?" "Well, I only kept the best ones." Minimization. I kept the best stuff. "Well, why did you keep the best stuff?" "The people made me do it." Minimization, denial, blame. Versus David, when he's confronted with his sin about Bathsheba, he writes Psalm 51 and says, "Give me a broken and a contrite heart. If you wanted sacrifices, I would do them." but my sacrifice to you is a broken heart. So when somebody presents a problem, and you get to choose if you run it through the contempt filter, but when you don't, when you say, this is contempt, they treated me with contempt, and I move into that, and I'm trying to win an argument rather than solve the problem. Now, when I'm trying to win the argument rather than solve the problem, I get into what's known as a zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game is like when you gamble or when you play checkers. I win, you lose. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm happy, you're sad. So you bring something to me, and instead of trying to fix the problem, I get into this contest where I'm trying to win. So it doesn't matter what it's about. Minimization, denial, blame are the things that I use to say, well, I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, I'm happy, you're sad. If I'm using a strategy like that, in order for me to go into combat mode, in order for me to go into a survival situation, in order for me to defend myself, my default setting has to be what? I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, I'm happy, you're sad. That's selfishness. See, when contempt enters into the room and we start arguing about something, and instead of trying to fix the problem and trying to hear your need for a positive request to have your needs met, I start defending this position, then it's not about us, it's about me. And when I'm selfish, what happens to our trust? We can't ever solve any problems. All we do is fight. Well, why do you fight and continue to fight? Well, we continue to fight because I don't trust this person. Well, why don't they trust you? Well, you're not trying to fix the problem. You're trying to win some silly contest. And listen, the person who's keeping score always feels like they're losing. And so I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, I'm happy, you're sad. And instead of trying to move toward a positive solution, we're playing these games. And then you'll find out later that typically somebody finally just throws up their hand and says, fine, forget it. Well, that didn't solve the problem. And that didn't make the problem go away. The problem went on a shelf in a closet. And they stack up and stack up and stack up and stack up. And then every time I open up the conflict closet, what falls out? And I'm so far behind in all the conflicts that I've lost that I never talk about the present. I always go back to the past. And that's why it's very, very important to understand you're not trying to win anything, you're trying to solve something. Okay? When we teach the police in de-escalation, you're not trying to solve this guy's problem, you're trying to resolve the situation. A lot of stuff brought him to this point when they called you. You can't fix it, you got to get him out of the middle of Walmart. Okay? And that is different. And the same thing, if every time we fight, we have to go back and fight everything we fought about for the last 10 years, that's why your arguments don't do any good. They don't solve any problems, and that's why people divorce. So when you get offered contempt, real or perceived, and I'm in charge of how I deliver it, and I'm actually in charge of how I receive it, if I don't receive it properly and I get into the defensive mode, then the third thing that happens, the third horseman of the apocalypse, is I drop into negativity. Now, negativity is a really interesting thing. Because you see, I've got to change the way I think about you. Remember Paul said to the Philippians, in lowliness of mind, treat the other person as more important? Well, by default, we typically don't think about the other person being important when we're in a defensive mode. I've got to maintain the energy to fight with you, and to maintain the energy to fight with you, I've got to view you differently. Read Dave Grossman's book on combat or on killing. You take a young man, you train him in special forces, you train him in special operations, and you send him over to the desert. We don't send people overseas to kill uncles, brothers, cousins, dads, and nephews. We send people over there to kill Sammies, skinnies, and ragheads. Why? It's easy to kill something that's not a person. It's easy to kill a Sammy, a skinny, or a raghead. It's hard to kill somebody who's an uncle, a brother, a dad, a cousin, a nephew. Right? So when my wife starts with me, that witch, that nag, when she starts with that ogre, that buffoon, that idiot, my lover, my husband, the father of my children, the mother of my children, See, when we get into this defensive mode, instead of seeing you in a positive light, I see you in a negative light. Because if I see you in positive light, it's hard for me to fight with my lover. It's hard for me to fight with my girlfriend. It's hard for me to fight with my soulmate. It's hard for me to fight with my sweetheart. I can fight with the wicked witch of the West all day long and sign up for overtime. And it really boils down to how I'm willing to view this person. So take your marriage and balance it. Satisfaction, disappointment. Celebration, regret. Affection, resentment. Me, us. Harmony or chaos. That's the story of you. When you tell the story of us, it's going to fall into one of those things. People who are in negative sentiment override. All they're thinking about is the negative. It's always resentment, disappointment, chaos, and dissatisfaction or disappointment. And really the story of us is never one or the other. It's a balancing act. But when you get somebody who says, we've never been happy, that's emotion-based thinking. Remember the story of Esau? Esau comes in from hunting. He's weary, he's tired, he's famished. He walks in and he sees his little brother cooking red soup. And he says, give me some red soup. And his little brother says, give me your birthright. Now, I don't know if he's that much of a criminal, if he's that much of a con man, or if that's a walkaway price. You know a walkaway price, right? You ask a guy to come do a small job with his welder, and he goes, well, this is what it costs. He goes, I'll walk away. The people who ask you to do things and they charge you really, really high, they really don't want the money. They want you to say no. A guy asked me to come climb and cut one of his trees. As you know, I'm not a professional tree cutter. I'm just a professional climber. And I said, so? He said, well, you know what the tree cutting surgery would charge me? I said, yeah, I know what tree cutters charge. I said, I'm not bonded or insured. If I fall out of this tree, who's going to feed my family? But I'll come over there because you're... And so I gave him a harness. I shot a line over a tree with a Wile E. Coyote slingshot. I tied him to the tree. I said, okay, all I got to do. He goes, whoa, 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 I thought you were going to cut it. I said, what would you pay me not to have to climb this tree right now? He said, hey, that tree guy's cheap. So the walkaway price is, I don't really want you to, I don't want to do it. Well, I don't know if Jacob is trying to get him just to, but notice what happens to his mindset. If I don't get that red soup, I'm going to die. Now you read the Hebrew words, weary, tired, famished, exhausted. How do you go from weary, tired, famished, exhausted, faint to I'm going to starve to death? The starving people I met couldn't walk. And this guy walks in from the woods and now he's got it in his mind, if I don't get that red soup, I'm going to die. That's emotion-based thinking. Now, if he takes his eyes off the red soup and looks around this camp, what's he going to see? I mean, who's his grandfather? His grandfather's Abraham. You guys seen the movie Secondhand Lions? The kid gets it all. Well, yeah, Isaac got it all. Everything. Abraham had an army of 300 men raised in his own household. And if you've got an army, you've got groceries. Because armies don't stay where they can't eat. And yet instead of thinking about pomegranates and sheep and goats and flocks and herds and men servants and maid servants, if I don't get that red soup, I'm going to starve to death. And then he does the classic warped logic. Well, if I die, my birthright's not going to do me any good here. Well, now, if you don't get the soup, you're going to die. What happens if you get the soup? Well, you're going to live, genius. And well, you need your birthright. And so he makes this irrevocable choice based on emotion-based logic. And it's terrible. And maybe he even thought to himself, sell my birthright? That's not a thing. I can't be unborn. I can't make you firstborn. And maybe he agrees to it because he doesn't think it's a thing. Well, you may not think an emotional affair is a thing. You may not think inverse of intimacy is a thing. You may not think anybody should be mad because what you're looking at on the internet is not a real person. It's a thing. And we get in that emotional-based mind that says, this is the only thing that'll make me happy, and this is the only solution I can see. And then we get into this negative sentiment override, and we start describing people with titles that justify our anger, that justify our wrath, that justify our revenge, that justify us being selfish. And in negative sentiment override, you can't balance celebration and disappointment, or celebration and regret, satisfaction, disappointment. You only measure the bad stuff. And you only think about the bad stuff. You only focus on the bad stuff. Why? So I can convince myself that I've got the right to do this. And by the way, if you decided, hey, I'm going to throw the towel in and I'm going to divorce, if you don't have a scriptural reason to remarry, write yourself a note. I'm leaving this marriage because I'm miserable and they're selfish, but they have not cheated on me, and I'm turning in my card to have sex. And put it in a safe deposit box. And 15 years later, when some guy flirts with you at the ballpark, and you decide, well, maybe he was fooling around on me. Or maybe I saw some signs and I suspected. Because you get into an emotion-based thinking, you'll rewire what you think your memories are. And you create a memory that helps you solve your problem. It happens all the time. We won't debrief a police officer after a shooting until he's been in 2 sleep cycles. Because if you interview him right then and there, I saw a gun. And his brain will create a gun when it was a cell phone. And you get him calmed down, give him 2 good sleep cycles, let that adrenaline burn off, and you start asking what happened, he'll have a better picture and he won't lie. But we convince ourselves of what we want ourselves to see and know when we are in an emotion-based thinking. Esau's an emotion-based thinking. He says, yeah, I'm going to die if I don't get that red suit. You can have my birthright. You know what the Hebrew writer says about him? He found no place for repentance, even though he sought it bitterly and with tears. So I feel contempt, or I deal with contempt. Somebody moves into negativity, or somebody moves into defensiveness in order to win this silly contest. I start thinking about only the negatives. I thought only think about the things that aren't working. I unbalance my relationship, and the story of us is not a story of 2 imperfect people trying to get to heaven and help each other get to heaven. My story is just about somebody who never and somebody who always. And then at some point you do the 4th thing, and that's called stonewalling. Some people call it turning away instead of turning toward. And so now, instead of looking for reasons for us to be together, I just write you off. If you will come to my office and you will get on the floor and fight with each other, I can help your marriage. But if you come to my office and one of you is numb, I'm not worried anymore. I just don't have the energy to do that. I'm not going to be disappointed again. I'm not going to invest. It's over. You've got to make an intentional effort to look for things to improve. You've got to act as if I love them, as if I respect them, as if I forgave them. Because once a person stonewalls, once a person gets into that withdrawal phase, it's almost impossible to get them to come back in. Now, if you take those 4 things and you think about, hey, when my spouse and I talk about important things or unimportant things, if you have one of those things present, you're in danger. If you have 2 or more of those things present, catastrophic system failure. And it's not about changing the way my spouse acts in conflict. It's about changing the way I act in conflict. Because your behavior does not have the ability to control my behavior. And if I abdicate that responsibility and allow the way you talk or the way you act to dictate how I behave, then I don't really understand what it is to be a mature adult. I don't understand what it is to be a mature Christian. Look at Matthew chapter 5 when Jesus talks about the way we interact with other people. I believe the Sermon on the Mount is a discourse from Jesus on internals versus externals. I think he starts talking about the Beatitudes, and the Beatitudes are the ideal way that people should behave from an internal locus of control, and then he confronts basically the idea of this is the way the Pharisees say you should do it, but this is how I say you should do it. Because when he starts in his preamble, after he does the Beatitudes, he says, do not think that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets. Well, the reason he gives them that warning is because he's going to say some things that sound like he's destroying the law and the prophets. See, if I walk up to you and say, hey, I don't want to hurt your feelings, what comes after that? But I don't want you to think I'm mad. Jesus just told this audience, I'm going to say some things, and you're going to get the idea I've come to destroy the law and the prophets. I didn't come to destroy, but to fulfill. And he talks about legalism, egotism, materialism, and criticism. And in the idea of talking about legalism, he's talking about how they interpreted the law. You've heard it said by those of old, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. This is chapter 5, verse 43. This is what you've heard all along. You've heard the Pharisees, you've heard the scribes, you've heard the Mishnah, you've heard the rabbis. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. In order that you'll be voted to attend the best barbecues, and your kids will be popular, you get to be on the city council. That's not, the Bible doesn't say that, right? You've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father. I act the way I act because of who I am. Your behavior doesn't dictate my behavior. Your attitude doesn't dictate my attitude. Your choices don't dictate my choices. I choose to do what I do because of how I see myself. And as a son of my Father in heaven, that's how I treat people. The good people, the bad people, the nice people, the unnice people, the people who deserve it, the people who don't deserve it. Because my control is an internal locus. It's located internally, not externally. Your faith does not affect your circumstances. But you should not let your circumstances affect your faith. And so when it comes down to, hey, who's in charge of making a reconciliation, turning toward this person, I really don't have any excuse except to say I've chosen not to make this thing work. Now, if I choose to work on it and you don't, at some point it may reach a place where it can't be fixed. But typically things that can't be fixed are because neither one of you's trying, not because both of you are. Okay? And so when it comes time to turn toward somebody, I've got to decide what I'm willing to let my pride go, whether I let my ego go. And if I trust you one more time and you abuse me, that says more about you than it does about me. Now, I think there's a place when there's been many violations of trust. You have to ask yourself, is this one of those irreconcilable things? But so many times we're willing to let one mistake ruin a marriage. We're willing to let one flaw, we're willing to let one hurt, and we grab hold of that thing and we hang on to it, we hang on to it, we hang on to it, we hang on to it. You cannot live in your past. And I don't care what it is. And I'm not endorsing divorce here, okay? But if your partner has done something and it was egregious and you can't get past it, and every time you're angry it comes up, you need to forgive them or leave them. But you can't live in the house with them telling them how terrible they are all the time. And even if you can't forgive them, you got to act like as if they're forgiven. Now, there are some situations, and Jesus says in the point of sexual improprieties, you have the right to divorce and remarry. You have the right, doesn't mean you have to. And I've had this discussion lots of times with people. A lot of times we wait till somebody violates that sexual prohibition. The marriage has been in trouble for years, and we use this as our get out of jail free card. But God's not going to be fooled. God's not going to be mocked. God's not going to be conned. You know why the marriage ended. And this is your excuse. You're never going to be happy in that situation because you're not addressing the problems that already exist. So if there's contempt and then there's defensiveness and then there's negativity, at some point instead of turning toward people, you either turn away from people or you turn against people. And those are three very important responses that have to have a distinction. Do you turn toward, do you turn away, or do you turn against? I met my wife when I was in college. I grew up in Oxford, Alabama. She grew up in Velvet Ridge, Arkansas. She went to school at Bald Knob High School in Bald Knob, Arkansas. I don't know if that was prophetic or what, but they taught math differently in Arkansas than they taught me in Alabama. I had a little Yankee teacher. She had a doctor from MIT. She taught math and algebra. I'm not a good math student. She found out me and my brother were brothers. She asked me, was I adopted? When I got my master's degree, I passed behavioral and inferential statistics. And I called Dr. Long. I said, Dr. Long, this is Lonnie Jones. She said, the Lonnie Jones? I said, yes, ma'am. She goes, and what correctional institution are we dialing? I'm not in prison. Anyway, when she taught us math, she had this number line on the floor. And she would walk forward for positive integers, and she would walk backwards for negative integers, and she would help us do this. And that stuck in my head. My wife has this mathematical theory that if something costs $500 and she can buy it for $200, she saved me $300. Now, if you walk forward 300 paces, we've saved $300, but you walked backwards 200 paces. We didn't save nobody no money. Two Benjamins walked out of my life, never to be seen or heard from again, and you saved me money. So we have these mathematical theorem debates based on what they taught her in Arkansas. Don't look at him that way with those judging eyes. I saw that. So I walk in and my wife announces, hey, I saved you some money today by spending $200. Well, thank you, dear. Well, we may have a discussion about that. Well, I decide that I probably need to fix that. So I come to my wife and say, honey, last night you saved me some money. And my wheels got in the ditch and I was angry about it and I shouldn't have. She can turn toward me and say, you know, I understand we're self-employed, you're trying to provide a good retirement, and we're doing the Dave Ramsey thing, and I just appreciate you being mindful of what we spend. Turning toward me. Or she can say, you know, I've got a job too. I'm a grown woman. I retired. The state sends me money every month, and you don't get to tell me how to spend my she's turned against me. Or she may say, you know, that's all you ever do is, I just don't want to talk about it. Now she's just turned away from me. Depending on how you respond to those things will depend on whether you move forward or live in your past in your relationship. And so when you have a difficulty, when something's going wrong and it's not ideal, and you first of all make a positive request to have your needs met. It's not what you say, but how you say it. It's not what you say, but why you say it. And sometimes it's not what you say, but when you say it. And so fixing on my delivery, then once I hear this thing, I get to run it through a filter. Am I only going to take the contempt, whether it's real or perceived, or am I going to say, okay, what are they really asking? What do they really want from me? Are they asking for a need to be met? They're not accusing me. They're not making me the bad guy. So what's the problem, and can I solve it? And then if I'm not being defensive, then I don't have to camp out on the times I win, the times I lose, all the negative stuff. I get to talk about, hey, this is where we're at. This is where we need to be better, to be happier, to be stronger, to be closer. And what do we need to do to get there? Your needs come before my rights. And sometimes your wants come before my wants. Because I'm viewing your world from your perspective, not mine. And then if we're not negative and fighting about unfinished business and we got a bunch of stuff we can't let go and we're living in the past, then at some point one of us is going to say, I'm too tired to do this, and he's going to tap out and he's going to quit. Now, you say, Lonnie, it's impossible when I'm that angry and I'm that aggravated. And I know some guys that are professional cage fighters. I know a kid named Elijah Carlton. He's going to be in Vegas at the end of this month in a thing called the PGF. There's $100,000 on the line if he can win this tournament. I know the kid named Travis Thomas. He's the Mantis. Pretty serious dude. I asked one of those guys, I was doing some performance anxiety with these guys. I said, so, we wrestle around here in the gym and we roll around. I said, how do you get the mindset of competition? I said, what do you do? Because a competitive level guy versus a hobby guy, that's a different animal. Okay, it's like a Yorkie versus a Rottweiler. He said, well, when I step in that cage, I go, you know what? If I can win this fight tonight, I'll take some money home to my family. And that guy there is trying to keep my kids from eating. Wow. I wouldn't get in a cage with a guy like that without a pistol. But those guys get in there and they try to pull each other's limbs off. They try to put each other to sleep. They try to knock each other out. Guess what happens when somebody does this? They instantly stop. And that's from the professional UFC all the way to the bare knuckle brawl in a bar somewhere. When a guy says, I'm done, they quit instantly. If a professional mixed martial artist can do that, fighting for money, you can do that with your spouse. When somebody says, we're getting too loud, we're getting too mean, this is scaring me. There's contempt, defensiveness, negativity in the room. Let's tap out and stop. And to tell me you can't is just not being honest. You don't want to because you've got a hold of that bone, you want to chew on it. We have the ability to control the dynamics of when we get angry and we get into an emotional mindset. And by the way, if you feel flooded, really cool way to stop, get out of that emotional mindset. Now, your emotions are information. They are not instruction. When you, and your emotions come from God. Every emotion you can have, you're allowed to have because God gave them to you. It's not having them, it's how He used them. Your emotions don't tell you to do something. They tell you something. And that's a big difference. But when we allow our emotions to tell us things, that's when we get in these rages. That's when we can't let go of a fight. That's when we can't quit talking. Because when we go, our brain moves from the prefrontal cortex to the neocortex, the mid part of the brain, and we're in fight or flight mode. When your emotions are high, your intellect is low. When your intellect is high, your emotions are low. In order to change brain parts, you got to think in facts. So, I start arguing with my spouse and I begin to see red and have auditory exclusion. If you'll just start, she's wearing red shoes. She's wearing blue pants. She curled her hair. There are 5 light bulbs in the room. If you'll do anything that deals with facts, your emotions go down, your intellect comes back up. If you'll count your pulse, and by the way, once your pulse moves above 100, it's called diffuse physiological arousal. Once your pulse goes above 100, when you're arguing with your spouse, you move from the front brain to the midbrain, and you're about as complicated as a goat. Everything is threat. It's black and white thinking. You can't process humor. You can't process logic. You really are in this subhuman state. And you've got to recognize that, hey, when I get there, if you'll do something as simple as take your pulse, by the way, taking your pulse is math. 6 seconds time 10, 10 seconds time 6. Well, you're doing math. You move from this part of your brain to this part of your brain. Anything that causes you to reduce that diffuse physiological arousal. And by the way, there's a thing called correlation. Not causation, but correlation. A perfect correlation is 1. Okay? Every time I push this past the edge, it'll fall. Every time this goes past the edge, it'll fall. That's a perfect correlation because that's the way gravity works. Diffuse physiological arousal, letting my heart rate get up and stay up and not calming it down. Diffuse physiological arousal and divorce has a 0.9 correlation. There's almost a perfect association between letting our emotions run wild and divorce. And so it's on us to start maintaining that control of that building. It's on us to maintain control of that vessel. Where we decide, hey, you know what? I'm not going to interpret that as contempt. It sounded contempt that even felt like contempt, but what's she really asking for? What's she really asking for? And so then I can change my mind state, and when my emotions go down, my intellect goes up. And then I'm not trying to hurt the person, I'm not trying to win some silly contest, but I'm trying to have a conversation about what we can do to make us better. That makes sense? Now I know I like to talk theory, and then I think I make it practical. Are there questions about this part of our discussion that I have not made clear or something you'd like to ask about? Yes, sir.
How did you finish the conversation with your wife?
Pardon?
How did you finish the conversation with your wife?
Well, I'm always wrong. I use that as an example. We have an agreement that if you spend over X amount of dollars, you have to have a conversation with your spouse. So if it's cost more than this, somebody has to know about it. Anything below that amount is discretionary funds. You do what you want to with it. We actually don't fight about that much. But if in that situation, we would come to an agreement that, hey, if you spend more than this much money, regardless of how good a sale it is, we need to talk about it first, if we're on a tight budget. Does that make sense? And so, and then you start talking about how we spend money or what we spend money on. When we come back from the break, I'll use my iPad and I'll show you kind of a time, money, energy paradigm for solving problems about time, money, and energy. All right? So let's take a real quick break. I'll fire up my iPad and we'll look at the Eisenhower box. Thanks.